I recently decided to revisit Middle-earth, all of it. I wanted to go back to that golden era, to re-experience Peter Jackson's trilogy, the unparalleled craftsmanship, the artistic integrity, the sheer unadulterated love for the source material. It's a miracle of filmmaking that honestly feels like it was forged in another age. But this time when rewatching Lord of the Rings, I didn't stop at Return of the King. I kept going through the 9-hour slog of The Hobbit's CGI bloat and narrative desperation, and into the billion-dollar algorithm-driven world of The Rings of Power. And somewhere in that journey from masterpiece to product, something hit me. Every adaptation of The Lord of the Rings reveals less about Tolkien, but more about us. It's a living myth, a legend that gets filtered through the anxieties, the ambitions, and the commercial pressures of every new generation that dares to retell it. It has been stretched, it's been commodified, and reimagined for an age of streaming content, and each new version holds up a mirror not only to Hollywood, but to ourselves as modern viewers as well. So, in this video, we're going to trace that journey. We're going to treat this franchise not as a sacred text, but as a cultural Rorschach test. We'll start with Jackson's perfect trilogy to understand why it's a miracle, then look at the hollow echo of that success in The Hobbit, and finally, the return to Middle-earth with Rings of Power, and its vision of myth as content. So let's see how each adaptation tells us about the ever-changing landscape of blockbuster filmmaking. Now, to understand the miracle of Peter Jackson's trilogy, you first have to understand what he was up against for decades. The Lord of the Rings was considered the unfilmable book, and for good reason. What Tolkien created was an act of what he called subcreation. He wasn't a fan of escapism. He was attempting to forge an entire mythology for England, a country whose own myths had been bulldozed by foreign invasions and industrial modernity. He created a work so dense and profound that he himself feared it would be vulgarized and distorted beyond recognition for mass appeal. And for a long time, he was right. The first attempts to bring Middle-earth to the screen were brave, bizarre, and fundamentally broken. The Rankin Bass Hobbit from 77 captured the folksy fairy tale spirit of that book, but it was a children's story. When Ralph Bakshi tried to tackle the main event in 78, he gave us a fever dream of rotoscoped animation that was visually ambitious but narratively incoherent. It just stopped halfway through, leaving audiences stranded. There was even a low-budget Soviet TV adaptation that was lost for decades, only to resurface looking like a high school play filmed in a local forest. These projects were the ghosts of what might have been cautionary tales that proved the book's reputation. It was too big, too deep, too damn literary to ever work on screen. And then in the late 1990s, an unlikely hero entered the picture. Peter Jackson, the guy who made his name with low-budget slapstick horror films. In a Hollywood landscape where fantasy was still considered silly kid stuff, a box office poison best left to Disney, he had a radical, almost heretical idea. He didn't want to adapt The Lord of the Rings as a fantasy, he wanted to adapt it as a history. He cited Braveheart as a touchstone. He wanted that feeling of grit, of mud and steel, of a world that was as real and tangible as our own. Not just a story about wizards and elves in spandex. This was about a believable world with believable stakes. Of course, Hollywood wasn't exactly rushing to hand over a 9-figure budget to the guy who made Meet the Feebles. The project first landed at Miramax under Harvey Weinstein, who in a move of pure studio brain genius insisted they cram all 3 books into one 2-hour movie. Let that sink in. The entire journey from the Shire to Mount Doom, the fall of Saruman, the battle for Minas Tirith, all of it condensed into 120 minutes. Jackson fought back, but Weinstein gave him an ultimatum: find another studio in a few weeks, or he'd get Quentin Tarantino to direct his butchered one-film version. In a desperate Hail Mary, Jackson's team created a pitch video and started shopping it around. Every studio said no, until at the last second it landed on the desk of Bob Shaye at New Line Cinema. And here, one of the greatest gambles in film history was made. Shaye himself looked at the 3 books and asked, why not make 3 movies? In a move that today's risk-averse Hollywood would call certifiably insane, New Line greenlit a nearly $300 million trilogy to be filmed all at once, by a director who had never handled anything remotely close to this scale. It was a revolution, and it only worked because the vision was backed by an unprecedented level of craftsmanship. They built cultures. The pre-production phase alone took 26 months. Jackson brought on legendary Tolkien illustrators Alan Lee and John Howe, the very artists who had defined redefined the look of Middle-earth for a generation of readers, and he made them the visual architects of his world. New Zealand became Middle-earth itself, its mountains, rivers, and plains giving the film a powerful sense of place that you just can't fake on a soundstage. The sheer scale of the practical work is still staggering. Weta Workshop created over 48,000 pieces of armor, 19,000 costumes, and 1,800 pairs of Hobbit feet. Everything in this world was built by hand with a level of detail that will likely never be repeated. And when they did turn to technology, they did it to solve problems, not to cut corners. They pioneered the massive software to create armies of thousands of digital soldiers, each with its own AI, so that battles felt like chaotic, clashing organisms. They used forced perspective, an old school magic trick to create the height difference between hobbits and humans, a technique that will never ever look dated. And of course, there was Gollum. Andy Serkis's performance combined with a revolution in motion capture technology created a digital character with a tragic, terrifying, and utterly believable soul. The perfect storm of practical artistry and digital innovation was held together by the narrative glue of Howard Shore's score. Shore composed over 100 distinct leitmotifs, weaving them together to tell the story through music. He even used Tolkien's invented languages in the choral pieces, giving each culture the ethereal grace of the elves, the guttural power of the dwarves, the corrupted fury of Mordor, its own unique sonic identity. But here's where the real genius comes in. Jackson knew that a direct page-by-page adaptation would be a disaster. A book is not a film, so he made intelligent surgical changes designed to translate Tolkien's spirit. They gave Aragorn a layer of self-doubt and reluctance to claim his throne, which wasn't as pronounced in the books, but it made him a far more compelling and relatable hero for a modern audience wrestling with ideas of destiny and duty. And their depiction of Sauron as a giant burning eye might have been a literal interpretation of a metaphor, but goddamn if it isn't an unforgettable and effective cinematic image for a formless, ever-present evil. These weren't acts of betrayal, but acts of translation. Jackson and his team understood that to make Middle-earth feel real, they had to make its characters feel human. They had to honor the moral architecture of Tolkien's world while building a cinematic structure that could support it. What emerged from this unprecedented gamble was truly a modern myth. Tolkien had buried a legend deep in the pages of his books. Jackson's team were the archaeologists who unearthed it, and with a perfect blend of old world craftsmanship and new world technology, they didn't just put the bones in a museum, they resurrected the dragon. So, how did Peter Jackson do it? He understood something fundamental about Tolkien's work. This wasn't just 3 separate stories, a movie with 2 sequels. That's the lazy corporate mandated structure we've become numb to. No, this was one story, a single unified saga, and it had to be built that way from the ground up. This is the key. The decision to shoot all 3 films back to back was a narrative one. It ensured a level of cohesion that most franchises can only dream of these days. There are no jarring tonal shifts, no character arcs that get dropped or retconned between films because a new writer came on board. The Fellowship of the Ring is the first act of a 10-hour epic. It meticulously lays the groundwork for every major character, setting them on a path that will pay off. Not at the end of this film, but at the end of the entire journey. The Two Towers is the connective tissue, seamlessly picking up the scattered threads and weaving them together, escalating the stakes and preparing the board for the final conflict. And the Return of the King is the devastating, emotionally exhausting, and deeply satisfying culmination of it all. It's a perfect 3-act structure just played out on a canvas the size of a world. And let's just take a second to appreciate The Two Towers for what it is, probably the greatest middle chapter ever made. Middle films are notoriously difficult, they have no real beginning and no real end, but Jackson turns this potential weakness into a strength. The film perfectly balances the burden of continuing established plot lines with the excitement of introducing new ones, the entire culture of Rohan, the majesty of the Ents. It deepens the world and raises the stakes in equal measure, a feat of narrative engineering that most modern trilogies, which often treat their middle entry as forgettable filler, could learn a thing or two from. Jackson masterfully juggles a dizzying number of storylines without ever losing focus. We cut between Frodo and Sam's agonizing trek through Mordor, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli's these desperate battles across Rohan and Merry and Pippin's entanglement with the Ents. But it never feels disjointed. Why? Because the film constantly reminds us that every single one of these threads is tied to the same anchor, the fate of the ring. The success of Aragorn's quest is meaningless if Frodo fails. The survival of Rohan is a hollow victory if the ring bearer succumbs. This narrative discipline keeps the stakes impossibly high and makes every small victory and every crushing defeat feel monumental. And the pacing is a work of art. Jackson understood the rhythm of a great saga. He knew when to unleash the spectacle, the jaw-dropping scale of Helm's Deep, the apocalyptic siege of Minas Tirith, but he also knew when to pull back, to give us the quiet, intimate moments that are the true heart of the story. Think about Helm's Deep. In the middle of this earth-shattering battle, the camera finds time for a terrified young boy and an old man handed swords they can barely hold. In that one small, heartbreaking moment, the epic conflict is distilled into a raw human tragedy. For every thundering charge of the Rohirrim, there's a quiet conversation between Frodo and Sam about the taste of strawberries and the memory of home. For every clashing of armies, there's a moment of quiet despair in Theoden's eyes. It's this balance that gives the world its weight, its soul. They made it not just a theme park ride blasting you from one set piece to the next, but a story that breathes. And the character architecture of this trilogy is, frankly, flawless. Each arc serves a distinct thematic purpose, and they all resonate with one another to create a collective emotional narrative. At the center of it all, you have Frodo and Sam. It's not a story of a superhero destined for greatness. It's a story about the devastating human cost of heroism. Frodo doesn't get stronger on his journey. Surprisingly, he only gets weaker. The ring poisons him, body and soul. You see it in the growing sores around his neck, the paranoia in his eyes, the way his spirit is slowly being hollowed out. It's a brutal, unflinching look at how a great burden can break even the purest of hearts. And holding him together piece by agonizing piece is Samwise Gamgee. Sam is the heart of the entire trilogy. He's just a gardener who heard about warriors and kings only in stories. He represents the simple, unshakable goodness that the story is all about. He's the embodiment of Tolkien's own experience in the trenches of World War I, the ordinary English soldier, steadfast and loyal in the face of unimaginable horror. When Frodo collapses on the slopes of Mount Doom, unable to go on, the climax of this entire epic saga isn't a sword fight. It's a gardener lifting his friend onto his shoulders and saying, "I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you." In that one moment, the film declares that true heroism isn't about love, loyalty, and a faith that endures when all hope is lost. Then you have Aragorn. In the book, he's already a king in waiting, confident and assured. Jackson's masterstroke was to make him a reluctant hero, a man haunted by the failure of his ancestor Isildur. He's afraid of the power that is his birthright, afraid that he too will succumb to the ring's temptation. His journey from a brooding ranger in the corner of a pub to the king who leads the armies of men is a powerful metaphor for accepting responsibility. We see the cautionary tale of this struggle in Boromir, a good man who was broken by the ring's promise of strength. Boromir's fall makes Aragorn's own triumph when he turns away from the ring at Armenhen, so much more powerful. It's an earned victory. His arc is a return of the king in a much larger sense, the return of myth, of hope, of honor in a world teetering on the edge of darkness. He is the man who succeeds where his ancestor failed, not through strength, but by choosing to trust in the strength of others. Next is Gandalf. He's the archetypal mentor, the wise old wizard, but he's so much more than that. He is the strategic linchpin of the entire war. His fall in Moria and his return as Gandalf the White is a classic resurrection motif, a symbol of hope reborn from sacrifice. But his real power isn't in his flashy magic, it's in his wisdom. He is the chess master who understands the board, orchestrating the defense of Middle-earth, rallying the broken spirit of Theoden and guiding the armies of men in a desperate gamble to distract Sauron's gaze. He is the timeless guide, the force of reason in a world consumed by chaos, a figure who seems to have stepped right out of the ancient myths Tolkien drew from, and you can't forget Gollum. What can you even say? Andy Serkis's performance didn't just pioneer a technology, it gave us one of the most complex, tragic, and unforgettable characters in cinema history. The scenes where Smaug and Gollum film argue with each other are a masterclass in psychological horror. He's a living, breathing study of addiction, of a soul torn in two by its own corruption. He is the tragic, withered heart of the entire story, a constant, terrifying reminder of what the ring can do and what Frodo could become. Jackson's direction allows all of these monumental arcs to coexist without ever overshadowing one another. He gives each character their moment, their struggle, their triumph. The result is a story that feels like it's being told not just about one hero, but about an entire world fighting for its soul. All of this is held together by an incredible level of storytelling discipline. There's a consistent tone and visual language that runs through all three films. This world feels grand, but it also feels grounded. It's a world of magic and monsters, but also of mud and sweat and fear. It's epic in scale, but it never loses its human touch. The visual grammar of the films trusts the audience. Exposition is delivered through action and environment, not through clumsy dialogue dumps. It's the antithesis of the lazy tell, don't show writing that plagues modern blockbusters. The thematic through line is crystal clear and is never ever lost amidst the spectacle. This is a story about mortality, about the courage of ordinary people, about the belief that there's good in this world and it's worth fighting for. And then there's the music. What Howard Shore did for this trilogy is nothing short of myth-making in its own right. His music is a narrative force on its own. The Shire's theme is a gentle, Celtic-inspired melody that evokes a sense of home and innocence. The theme for Rohan is mournful and noble, carried by a Norwegian Hardanger fiddle, giving it a distinct, ancient, almost Viking-like sound. We hear it first as a lament for a dying kingdom, but it swells into a thundering, triumphant charge at the Pelennor Fields. The music of Mordor is dissonant and industrial, full of crashing metal and guttural chanting in black speech. The score tells you everything you need to know about a culture before a single word of dialogue is spoken. It is the emotional and narrative glue that binds this entire 10-hour epic together, and it's a monumental artistic achievement that has never been surpassed. So why does this trilogy endure? Why, over 20 years later, does it still feel like the pinnacle of blockbuster filmmaking? A feat that Hollywood has been desperately and unsuccessfully trying to replicate ever since? It's not just because it's a faithful adaptation, though, it is one of the most faithful ever made. It's because Jackson and his team did something far more difficult. They translated Tolkien's moral architecture into the language of cinema. They understood that the power of this story wasn't in the magic rings or the big battles. It was in the quiet moments of courage, the bonds of fellowship, and the unwavering hope in the face of absolute despair. The result isn't fan service. It's mythic storytelling, pure and simple. It's a timeless structure told with modern craftsmanship, a perfect marriage of art and spectacle. It's the kind of filmmaking that enriches you with story and changes you through the whole journey. It reminds you of the part of yourself that still believes in heroes, in sacrifice, and in the idea that even the smallest person can change the course of the future. It was, and still is, a golden era. And as we were about to find out, it was one that could never be repeated. When some movie truly hits the hearts of the viewers, the first thing Hollywood tries to do is build a factory of mass production. After the unprecedented critical, cultural, and financial success of The Lord of the Rings, a return to Middle-earth was inevitable. The problem was, there was nothing left to adapt. Tolkien's other major works were either too dense, like the Silmarillion, or the rights were tied up in a legal Gordian knot. All that remained was a slim, charming children's book called The Hobbit. And here is where the story of the Golden Era ends and the story of the franchise era begins. Initially, the project had promise. Guillermo del Toro, a filmmaker with a unique and visionary style, was set to direct. He envisioned 2 films, a creative choice that could have respected the smaller, more episodic nature of the book while still giving it room to breathe. But after years stuck in development hell, Del Toro departed, and Peter Jackson reluctantly at first stepped back into the director's chair. And somewhere along the way, a 2-film plan, already a stretch for a 300-page book, became a 3-film epic. It was a business decision, plain and simple, and it was a decision that fundamentally broke the story before a single frame was shot. The Lord of the Rings was a sprawling 1,200-page epic with a structure perfectly suited for a trilogy. The Hobbit is a whimsical adventure, a fairy tale. To stretch it into a 9-hour blockbuster, the filmmakers had to inject it with artificial stakes, bloated subplots, and a relentless, exhausting sense of spectacle that was completely at odds with the source material's humble soul. The result is a trilogy in a state of constant, schizophrenic conflict with itself. It wants to be the light-hearted adventure of the book, but it also desperately wants to be the grim, world-ending epic of The Lord of the Rings. It tries to be both, and in the end, it fails at being either. The production itself was a nightmare, a stark contrast to the meticulous, years-long preparation of the first trilogy. Jackson has openly talked about how chaotic it was. He was exhausted working 21-hour days, often designing scenes on the fly with no time for storyboards. Where the first trilogy was a labor of love, this felt like a forced march, and you can feel that exhaustion on screen. You see it most clearly in the visuals. The first trilogy's perfect blend of practical effects and groundbreaking CGI gave it a timeless, tangible reality. The Hobbit trilogy, on the other hand, is a monument to digital excess. The gritty, menacing, practically made orcs of the first films are replaced with rubbery, weightless CGI abominations that look like they've escaped from a mid-2000s video game. Entire landscapes feel artificial, slathered in a digital sheen that keeps you at a distance. Even Sir Ian McKellen spoke about his misery on set, acting against 13 photos of dwarves on light stands in a sea of green screen instead of standing on an actual mountaintop. The magic was gone, replaced by a sterile, isolating technology. The storytelling suffers the same fate. To fill 9 hours of screen time, the narrative is padded with invented nonsense that serves no purpose other than to artificially connect it to the more successful trilogy. We get a completely fabricated love triangle between the dwarf Keely and a newly invented elf, Toriel, a plot point so agonizingly cliche and emotionally weightless that it grinds the film to a halt every time it appears. Legolas is shoehorned in, despite having no place in the book, purely for fan service. He's no longer the stoic, almost ethereal warrior from the first films. Now he's a video game character, defying gravity and logic in action sequences that are more ridiculous than thrilling. The films are littered with these narrative crutches, clumsy attempts to remind you of the better movies you'd rather be watching. The most egregious example is the entire subplot involving Sauron, the Necromancer, and the White Council. Yes, this is technically pulled from Tolkien's appendices, but in the context of the Hobbit's story, it's completely irrelevant. It's a B-plot that exists solely to give Gandalf something to do while he's off-page in the book, and to create a sense of epic, world-ending stakes that the actual A-plot, 13 dwarves trying to reclaim their home, simply doesn't have. It pulls focus, breaks the pacing, and ultimately feels like a trailer for The Lord of the Rings clumsily inserted into the middle of another movie. Because of all this bloat, the actual protagonist of the story, Bilbo Baggins, often feels like a guest in his own movie. The narrative is so preoccupied with Thorin Oakenshield's brooding drama and the manufactured epic conflict that Bilbo's quiet personal journey from a comfortable homebody to a reluctant hero gets sidelined. His character arc is rushed through in the first film, leaving him with very little to do for the next 6 hours. Obviously being made by Jackson himself, these movies are not a complete dumpster fire. There are moments of genuine brilliance buried beneath the rubble of studio interference and digital sludge. Martin Freeman is, without question, the perfect Bilbo Baggins. His performance is a masterclass in comedic timing, understated charm, and quiet courage. The scenes where the film just allows him to be Bilbo are easily the strongest. His game of riddles with Gollum is a standout, a tense, beautifully acted piece of theater that feels like it belongs in a much better movie. Howard Shore's score, once again, is magnificent. The dwarves' haunting rendition of Misty Mountains Cold is one of the most powerful and thematically perfect pieces of music in the entire 6-film saga, and you cannot deny the sheer terrifying majesty of Smaug. Voiced with sinister perfection by Benedict Cumberbatch, the dragon is a triumph of character design and a truly menacing villain. But these moments of light only serve to highlight the darkness surrounding them. They are echoes of the greatness that came before, reminders of what could have been if the story had been allowed to be what it was. A smaller, more personal tale of adventure and discovery. Instead, the Hobbit trilogy stands as a perfect reflection of a new Hollywood, one that had learned all the wrong lessons from the success of The Lord of the Rings. It saw the myth, but it only valued the money. It mistook scale for substance, spectacle for soul. It commodified the very everything it once revered, taking a beloved story and stretching it on the rack until it broke. After the bloated misfire of The Hobbit, you'd think Hollywood might have learned its lesson. You'd think they'd understand that Middle-earth isn't a formula you can replicate, not a brand you can just slap on a product to guarantee success. You'd be wrong. Enter the streaming wars. In the late 2000s, every major tech company was desperately trying to build an arsenal of content to compete with Netflix. Amazon, with its near infinite war chest, needed a crown jewel, a flagship series so massive it would crush the competition. Jeff Bezos himself gave the mandate, "Get me my Game of Thrones." And what do you get when you combine a trillion-dollar corporation's desire for its own Game of Thrones with the appendices of a book they don't fully own the rights to? You get the Rings of Power. Let's get one thing straight right out of the gate. This show is, without a doubt, one of the most visually stunning things ever put on television. With a budget that makes most blockbuster films look like student projects, every frame is a breathtaking digital painting. The sun-drenched shores of Numenor, the golden forests of Lindon, the subterranean grandeur of Khazad Dûm. It's all rendered with an astonishing level of detail. Bear McCreary's score, with an opening theme from Howard Shore himself, works overtime to create a musical lineage with Jackson's films, desperately trying to convince you that you are, in fact, back in Middle-earth. And for moments, it almost works. But even the visuals feel hollow. Jackson's trilogy used its effects, both practical and digital, to create a world that felt tangible, that had dirt under its fingernails. The Rings of Power feels like an impossibly detailed tech demo. For all its billion-dollar polish, the world feels strangely small. The epic battles feel like small-scale skirmishes. The grand cities feel like empty sound stages. It's a world without weight, a beautiful illusion that shatters the moment you try to touch it. It's a beautiful painting, but it's worthless without a frame, and the narrative frame of this show is fundamentally, catastrophically broken. This is a corporate product, a show built not from a passion for the source material, but from a marketing brief. It's an imitation, a soulless echo that wears the skin of Tolkien's world, but possesses none of its heart. The show's original sin, the decision from which all other problems flow, is its structure. The showrunners were faced with a dilemma. The second age of Middle-earth spans thousands of years. How do you tell a coherent story with human characters who would live and die between episodes? Their solution: they compressed the entire multi-millennial history of an epoch into a single human lifespan. Only at first it could be seen as a creative choice. In fact, it was a commercial one, a cynical move to force Tolkien's sprawling mythic history into the familiar multi-threaded structure of Game of Thrones. The result is a narrative that is both glacially slow and ridiculously rushed. We spend entire episodes watching characters walk through fields and have stilted, generic conversations that go nowhere, only to have one of the most significant events in the history of Middle-earth, the forging of the Rings of Power themselves, crammed into the last 10 minutes of a season finale like a tacked-on afterthought. The pacing is an absolute disaster, a story with no sense of time, no sense of consequence, and no emotional weight. And the writing, this is where the billion-dollar budget runs out and the show's profound lack of talent becomes painfully obvious. Characters teleport across continents when the plot requires it and make decisions so fundamentally stupid you have to wonder if anyone in the writer's room has ever read a book. The dialogue is atrocious. A bizarre mix of pseudo-poetic platitudes and modern corporate speak that sounds like it was written by an AI that was fed a diet of self-help books and bad fantasy novels. It constantly strains for a profundity it never earns, landing on lines that feel like they were pulled from an inspirational poster in a soulless corporate office. The plot is held together by a string of lazy coincidences and baffling character decisions. It's a show that constantly mistakes mystery for depth, bombarding the audience with J.J. Abrams-style mystery boxes. Who is the stranger? Who is Sauron? Things that were meant to be compelling dramatic questions end up as cynical marketing hooks designed to generate online speculation and keep you hate watching. A manipulative trick Jackson's trilogy never had to stoop to because it actually respected its audience enough to just tell them a good story. But nowhere is this failure more apparent than in its characters. This show commits the ultimate sin. It makes Tolkien's world boring, and it does that by taking his most complex and iconic figures and flattening them into one-dimensional archetypes. Let's take Galadriel. In Tolkien's lore and in Jackson's films, she is one of the oldest, wisest, and most powerful beings in Middle-earth. She has seen the rise and fall of empires, carries the wisdom of ages, and is defined by her grace and her internal struggle against the temptation of power. The Rings of Power throws all of that in the garbage and turns her into a hot-headed, single-minded, vengeance-driven warrior. A toxic girl boss who is arrogant, reckless, and refuses to listen to anyone. She spends the entire season making catastrophic mistakes. What could be okay for the building of a character, but she learns absolutely nothing from them. It's the modern, creatively bankrupt definition of a strong female character. Strip away all femininity, vulnerability, and wisdom, and replace it with a scowl and a sword. Compare this to Eowyn. Her strength was in her defiance of a cage, her yearning for honor, and her profound vulnerability. She was a complete three-dimensional human being. This version of Galadriel is a one-note action figure, a walking embodiment of a corporate mandate for a badass lead, and in the process, they made one of the most beloved figures in the lore more unlikable than the literal Dark Lord she's hunting. And speaking of Sauron, what a mess. Instead of the cunning deceiver Anatar, the Lord of Gifts who seduces the elves with knowledge and flattery, we get Halbrand, some random dude they find on a raft who is given the backstory of a lost king and portrayed as a broody, sympathetic anti-hero. The show genuinely tries to make you feel sorry for the ultimate embodiment of evil, turning him into a reluctant villain who just wants to heal Middle-earth. It's the sympathetic villain trope, a modern obsession that insists on finding the broken man inside the monster. And while that can work for some stories, for Sauron, it's a catastrophic failure. He isn't a complex, morally grey character. He is the shadow, the abyss, the will to dominate all life. By trying to make him relatable, the show strips him of his terror and reduces a mythic evil to a misunderstood bad boy. But the show's most infamous act of canonical vandalism, the moment that truly crystallized its creative bankruptcy, has to be the Mithril Chlorian situation. In a move of breathtaking stupidity, the show invents a new legend, that Mithril contains the light of the lost Silmarils and that the elves are fading and need the Mithril to survive. It's an attempt to create a grand unified theory for Tolkien's world to explain a magic that never needed explaining. It reduces the elves' long, slow, tragic decline, a core theme of Tolkien's work about the fading of magic from the world, to a medical condition that can be cured with a magical metal. It's a solution in search of a problem, a cheap, contrived plot device that displays a fundamental contempt for the source material's subtlety and depth. And this is where we come back to our thesis. The Rings of Power reveals almost nothing about Tolkien and everything about 21st century corporate entertainment. It's a perfect mirror of our time. The show is obsessed with modernizing Tolkien, injecting a world of myth and absolute morality with the language of contemporary politics and the shallow complexities of modern TV drama. The conflict in Numenor isn't about a profound existential fear of mortality. It's just a generic surface-level debate about immigration. The characters' motivations aren't driven by oaths and destiny as you would expect in a myth-driven story. No, here they're driven by trauma and personal vendettas. It uses nostalgia as a weapon, constantly winking at the audience with visual cues, musical motifs, and even direct lines of dialogue that reference Jackson's films. They're like nostalgia berries, a cynical attempt to hijack the emotional connection you have with the better movies to make up for the show's own emotional emptiness. It's a production that proves you can spend $1 billion to buy the map of Middle-earth, but you can't buy its soul. What we're left with is a beautiful, impossibly expensive, and completely hollow Fabergé egg. It's myth as content, a legend repackaged for the algorithm. And it stands as the ultimate cautionary tale of what happens when the Ring of Power isn't a magical artifact, but a quarterly earnings report. The shadow that Peter Jackson's trilogy cast over popular culture is absolute. It's a shadow that reshaped the entire landscape of fantasy entertainment. Before The Lord of the Rings, blockbuster fantasy was a joke. After it, it became the benchmark. Tolkien, through Jackson, legitimized the very idea of a secondary world, a fully realized fictional universe with its own history, cultures, and internal logic. And that blueprint became the holy grail for every creator and every studio that followed. followed. You don't get the political machinations of Westeros and Game of Thrones without the precedent of a fantasy epic being treated with deadly seriousness. You don't get the sprawling mythic worlds of video games like The Elder Scrolls or Dark Souls and Elden Ring without the hunger for deep, immersive lore that Tolkien's work created. The DNA of Middle-earth is so deeply embedded in modern fantasy that it's practically invisible, the bedrock upon which the entire genre is built. And that legacy is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it created a massive, hungry audience for the kind of storytelling that is deep, thematic, and emotionally resonant. But on the other, it created an impossibly high standard, a golden yardstick against which every subsequent fantasy epic is measured and, more often than not, found wanting. The audience, now conditioned by Jackson's masterpiece, expects a level of authenticity, of soul, of pure, unadulterated love for the material that modern, franchise-obsessed Hollywood is almost incapable of delivering. This is the narrative straitjacket that every new Middle-earth project finds itself in. The studios are desperate to monetize the nostalgia for that perfect moment, but they fundamentally misunderstand what made it work. They think the magic was in the big armies, the sweeping vistas, and the iconic characters, so they give us more, bigger CGI armies, even more sweeping vistas, and clumsy fan service cameos. They use the original trilogy as a crutch, a collection of nostalgia berries to be sprinkled over a new product to trick you into feeling something. Remember how much you loved this? They whisper as they show you a shot that is a direct copy of one from the films, or have a character deliver a line that's a pale imitation of a classic. Well, here's more of that thing you loved, just worse. It's a cynical, manipulative tactic, and it reveals a profound lack of confidence in their own storytelling. Instead of trying to create something new that stands on its own, they're content to be a pale, soulless imitation. And that brings us to the future. Because of course there's a future. The myth of Middle-earth is too powerful and too profitable to ever be left alone for long. Warner Brothers is now gearing up to churn out a new slate of projects, and the cycle is beginning all over again. And there is one project that causes a lot of fear and pain already: the hunt for Gollum. Let me say that again, just so the sheer, uninspired, creatively bankrupt desperation of that title can really sink in. The Hunt for Gollum. A movie about Aragorn and Gandalf looking for Gollum between the events of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Footnote: definitely. It's a piece of narrative housekeeping that Tolkien wisely left off the page because he knew it was dramatically uninteresting. And now, it's going to be a major motion picture, directed by and starring Andy Serkis, with Peter Jackson producing. I have absolutely zero hope for this because it's looked like a content farming. It's the cinematic equivalent of a DVD extra, a deleted scene stretched to 2 hours, and it represents everything wrong with the modern franchise mindset. It's a story with no stakes, because we already know how it ends. We know they find him. We know what happens next. It's a prequel that answers a question nobody was asking. A project so risk-averse, so creatively timid, that it feels less like a movie and more like a corporate retreat to a familiar location. And this is the enduring challenge for Middle-earth. Can a myth survive this level of constant commercial reinterpretation? Can a world built on themes of subtlety, grace, and quiet heroism endure in an age of non-stop algorithm-driven content? Every new project chips away at the legacy, diluting the magic and making the perfect miracle of the original trilogy feel more and more like a distant, unrepeatable dream. But here's the strange, resilient truth of it all. The myth endures. Even the failures like The Hobbit and Rings of Power don't kill it. If anything, they do the opposite. They act as a catalyst. They send us back. They make us want to re-watch the good movies, to reread the books, to engage with the part of the franchise that still has its soul intact. They remind us by sheer contrast of what true greatness looks like. Tolkien's world is a kind of perpetual motion machine. Its depth and universal themes guarantee it will always find a new audience, and its commercial power guarantees that studios will never stop trying to mine it for profit. But each time they do, they put the myth on trial. They force us to ask again and again, are they here to honor the legend, or are they just here to sell us the merchandise? The answer, more and more, seems painfully obvious. So, we come to the end of our journey and we're left with the one undeniable truth that has echoed through every adaptation, every success, and every failure. What we see in Middle-earth says far more about us than it does about Tolkien. The original trilogy, Jackson's masterpiece, was a miracle. It was the product of a perfect, unrepeatable alignment of passion, craftsmanship, and a pre-franchise Hollywood that was still willing to take a monumental gamble on a director's vision. It reflected a world post 9/11 that was hungry for a story of unambiguous good confronting an overwhelming evil, a story that championed hope, friendship, and the courage of the small against the vast impersonal machineries of war. It gave us a myth we desperately needed, a moral anchor in a time of uncertainty. The Hobbit trilogy was a reflection of a different world. A Hollywood drunk on the success of the Marvel formula, convinced that bigger was always better and that any beloved story could be cynically inflated into a blockbuster franchise. It was a mirror held up to an industry that had forgotten the difference between a story and a product, that valued spectacle over soul, and that believed the loyalty of an audience was something to be exploited, not earned. And the Rings of Power is the perfect myth for the age of the algorithm. It is a reflection of our modern corporate landscape, a world of streaming wars and content pipelines, where stories are judged not by their artistic merit, but by their ability to drive engagement and capture market share. It's a world that tries to sand down the sharp edges of Tolkien's morality, to make his absolute evils relatable, and to inject his timeless world with the fleeting, transient language of contemporary politics. It's a mirror held up to a culture that is so desperate for new content that it's willing to accept a beautifully rendered, impossibly expensive, and completely hollow imitation of the real thing. Each adaptation is an act of translation. It translates Tolkien's dense literary world into the visual language of cinema, but it also translates the values of its own time. It translates the hopes and fears, the artistic ambitions, and the commercial imperatives of the people who create it and the audience that consumes it. The myth itself is the constant. We are the variable. And that, I think, is the ultimate testament to the power of Tolkien's creation. The myth survives. It survives being stretched, it survives being commodified, and it survives being misunderstood. Because at its core, it speaks to something in us that is fundamental and unchanging. It's not just escapism. We don't return to Middle-earth to run away from the world. We return because, in its reflection, we see the best parts of ourselves. We see the unwavering loyalty of a friend who will carry you when you cannot walk. We see the courage to stand against impossible odds, not because you are guaranteed to win, but because it is the right thing to do. We see the profound truth that mercy and pity are not weaknesses, but the greatest strengths we possess. Myths are mirrors for our hearts. They show us symbols that resonate with our own lives, and sometimes, in a moment of terrifying, beautiful recognition, we look into that mirror and we say, that is me. That is my struggle. That is my hope. That is my despair. And when a story can do that across generations, across cultures, and across the ever-shifting landscape of Hollywood, it ceases to be just a story. It becomes a part of us, a home we can always return to. Perhaps that's why we keep returning to Middle-earth. Not to escape the world, but to remember the part of ourselves that still believes in it. So that's our journey for today. It's a long, often disappointing road from the golden age of myth-making to the modern age of content. But analyzing these stories, the triumphs and the failures, is a reminder of what we're all searching for in the first place. If you want to join the fellowship for the next deep dive and continue the hunt for stories that are still worth believing in, then make sure you subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching and take care.